Before sunrise, a medieval village was already beginning to stir. In a small timber and stone cottage, a farmer opened his eyes beneath a rough wool blanket. There was no alarm clock, no electric light, and no hurried notification waiting beside his bed. Instead, the first signs of morning came from nature itself. A pale glow appeared through the tiny window. Birds began calling outside, and the household slowly prepared for another ordinary day. The farmer rose from his straw mattress, pulled on his simple wool clothing, and checked the dying embers of the hearth. His first thoughts were practical. There was water to collect, food to prepare, animals to check, and work waiting in the fields. For most medieval people, the day was not divided by meetings, screens, or scheduled appointments. It was shaped by daylight, weather, seasons, and necessity. Morning meant beginning the long list of tasks that kept a household alive. Even before breakfast, several small jobs needed attention. A fire had to be revived, water brought inside, and tools prepared. This was the quiet beginning of another ordinary day in the Middle Ages. One of the first tasks of the morning was collecting water. The nearest clean source might be a village, well, spring, or stream, and reaching it could take several minutes or longer, depending on where a household lived. The farmer carried a wooden bucket along the narrow dirt path, while the village slowly awakened around him. Other villagers were beginning similar chores. Someone might be carrying a basket, another person checking animals, while others prepared fires inside their cottages. The well was an important meeting place, but most people had little time for idle conversation. Water was needed for drinking, cooking, washing, and animals. A household could not simply turn a tap and fill a container. Every bucket represented effort. After drawing water from the well, the farmer carefully carried it home without spilling too much along the uneven path. This simple activity could be repeated several times during the day. Medieval daily life was filled with such movements that modern people rarely notice. Carrying water, gathering fuel, cleaning tools, and preparing food consumed a surprising amount of time. These ordinary chores formed the foundation of life for nearly everyone. Back inside the cottage, the morning meal was prepared. Medieval breakfast was usually simple rather than elaborate. Depending on wealth and location, people might eat bread, porridge, cheese, eggs, vegetables, or leftovers from the previous evening. The farmer placed a clay pot near the hearth and began preparing food while the fire slowly grew stronger. There was no refrigerator to preserve fresh ingredients, so households relied heavily on foods that could be stored safely. Grain, dried peas, beans, salted meat, cheese, and preserved vegetables were valuable because they could last longer. Bread was especially important and could appear at nearly every meal. Preparing it was not a quick modern activity. Grain had to be processed, flour prepared, dough mixed, and the oven heated. Even a simple meal, therefore, depended on many earlier tasks. After eating, the household still had work to do. Bowls needed cleaning, food needed storing, and the fire needed attention. Medieval people did not spend their mornings simply relaxing before work. Domestic responsibilities were already underway. The day had begun and the household had to keep moving. For many medieval families, grinding grain was another regular chore. Grain was the foundation of much of the medieval diet, but turning harvested grain into usable flour required effort. Some households used a hand quern, while others took grain to a communal or water-powered mill when one was available. Our farmer carried grain toward the mill, following a familiar dirt road beyond the village. The journey itself became part of the daily routine. Along the way, he passed fields where other villagers were already working. Medieval farming was rarely a solitary activity. People worked alongside family members, neighbors, and sometimes animals. At the mill, grain could be crushed between heavy stones, producing flour that would later become bread or porridge. The process might seem ordinary, but it represented an important connection between farming and eating. A loaf of bread on a medieval table was the final result of planting, harvesting, threshing, grinding, kneading, and baking. Each stage required human effort. When the farmer eventually returned with flour, he was not simply carrying food, he was carrying the result of an entire chain of work. After the morning meal, much of the day was usually devoted to work. For rural people, farming was among the most important occupations. The farmer walked toward Kiko the fields with a simple wooden tool, ready to continue whatever seasonal task was necessary. In spring, fields needed preparing and seeds had to be planted. Summer brought weeding, tending, and protecting crops. Autumn was dominated by harvesting, while winter shifted attention toward animals, repairs, stored food, and other indoor work. The same person could perform many different jobs throughout the year. Medieval life did not always separate occupations as neatly as modern society does. A farmer might also repair fences, care for animals, mend clothing, collect firewood, or help with construction. Every useful skill mattered. The work was physical, repetitive, and strongly influenced by the weather. A rainy day could delay field work, while a long dry period could threaten an entire harvest. People therefore watched the sky carefully. The success of the household depended partly on forces they could not control. As the morning continued, the farmer bent over the soil, performing one small task after another, just as generations before him had done. By mid-morning, the farmer was deep into the ordinary work of the fields. He loosened the soil around young plants, removed weeds, and checked whether the crops were growing properly. None of these tasks looked dramatic, yet they were essential. A neglected field could mean less food months later. Medieval farmers therefore spent many hours doing repetitive work that modern machines can complete in minutes. A simple wooden hoe was one of the tools that helped them manage the soil. Nearby, other villagers worked in their own strips of land. The village depended on cooperation as much as individual effort. People might borrow tools, exchange labor, help repair fences, or assist during especially demanding seasons. Even when everyone worked separately, their routines were connected. The rhythm of the field was slow and steady. There was no need to hurry simply to finish a fixed number of hours. Daylight itself determined much of the schedule. As the sun climbed higher, shadows shortened and the morning became warmer. The farmer paused occasionally to drink water before returning to the same patient work. For him, this was not unusual or boring in the negative sense. It was simply what an ordinary day required. As the morning continued, the farmer moved from one small task to another. He checked the rows of crops, pulled unwanted plants from the soil, and looked for signs of damage from insects or animals. Medieval agriculture required constant attention because there were few reliable ways to protect a harvest once it was growing. A single poor season could create serious difficulties later. The farmer therefore learned to notice small changes in the field. He knew which areas stayed wet after rain, where the soil was thin, and which plants needed more attention. Experience was one of the most valuable tools he possessed. Around him, the village landscape was slowly filling with activity. Children might carry small baskets, older people could work closer to home, and stronger adults handled heavier agricultural tasks. The work of different generations overlapped. Even simple chores could teach younger members of the household skills they would eventually need themselves. There was no sharp boundary between childhood and useful work in many medieval communities. As the sun rose higher, the farmer continued his steady rhythm. He was not trying to create something extraordinary. He was simply maintaining the small piece of land that helped keep his household fed through another season. As the sun climbed higher, the farmer took a short pause beside the field. He drank water from a wooden cup and looked across the village. From a distance, medieval life could appear peaceful and simple, but almost every part of the landscape required regular work. Fields needed tending, fences needed repairs, animals needed feeding, and food had to be prepared and stored. Even a quiet cottage depended on dozens of small tasks. After his brief rest, the farmer noticed a broken section of wooden fencing near the edge of the field. He carried a few branches over and began repairing it. A sturdy fence protected crops from wandering animals and marked the boundary of cultivated land. The repair was slow because everything was done with basic hand tools. He positioned a wooden post, tightened the rough pieces of timber, and tested the fence with his hands. Nearby, another villager was doing something similar. Such practical repairs were a normal part of the working day. Medieval people constantly maintained the things they owned because replacing them was difficult and expensive. A broken basket, shoe, tool, fence, or piece of clothing was often repaired rather than discarded. This habit of maintenance quietly occupied many hours of everyday medieval life. By late morning, the farmer returned to the fields and continued the steady work that had occupied much of his day. He checked the young crops, loosened compact soil, and removed weeds growing between the rows. Nearby, another villager repaired a section of wooden fencing while several animals grazed beyond the boundary. Nothing about the scene seemed remarkable, yet these ordinary activities were essential to survival. Medieval people spent enormous amounts of time maintaining the things around them because almost nothing could simply be replaced. A broken tool might be repaired, a torn garment patched, and a damaged basket carefully rewoven. Even fences were regularly inspected because wandering animals could destroy valuable crops. The farmer paused beside one weak post and pushed it firmly into the ground before securing it with rough wooden branches. Once the repair was finished, he returned to the field. His work followed the rhythm of the season rather than the clock. The position of the sun helped him judge the passing hours, while hunger and fatigue reminded him when it was time to rest. For an ordinary medieval villager, much of life consisted of these small, repeated responsibilities. They rarely made history books, but together they filled the greater part of an average day. By midday, the farmer's morning work had already taken several hours. He gathered his tools and slowly walked back toward the village, passing fields where other workers were beginning to pause. The dirt paths were busy with ordinary movement. Someone carried a basket of vegetables, another person led a small group of animals, while children helped with smaller household tasks. Back at the cottage, the farmer washed his hands and prepared a simple meal. There was no need for an elaborate lunch. A bowl of porridge, some bread, vegetables, cheese, or leftovers could provide enough energy for the afternoon. Meals were practical because food itself represented work. Grain had been grown, harvested, threshed, ground, and baked. After eating, the farmer cleaned the wooden bowl and cup before preparing for the next part of the day. Even this simple cleanup took time because water had to be carried and every useful container had to be washed by hand. The short midday meal offered a small break from physical work, but it did not end the day's responsibilities. Soon, the farmer would return outside and begin another set of familiar tasks. After the midday meal, the farmer returned outside and began another part of his daily routine. The afternoon could involve many different jobs depending on the season. Today, he decided to work in the small garden beside the cottage. He checked rows of onions, beans, herbs, and other useful plants, removing weeds and loosening the soil around them. A household garden was valuable because it provided food close to home and reduced the need to travel for every ingredient. The farmer also inspected a few plants that appeared weak and watered them carefully. This water had been carried earlier from the village well, making even a simple garden chore part of a much longer chain of work. Nearby, a family member sorted vegetables and placed some into woven baskets for storage. Medieval households often depended on careful planning because food had to last between harvests. Nothing was casually wasted. Damaged vegetables might be cooked immediately, while better produce could be stored for later. The afternoon remained quiet, with only the sounds of birds, animals, tools, and distant voices filling the village. For many medieval people, an ordinary day was not filled with spectacular events. Instead, it was made from hundreds of practical decisions and repetitive tasks that slowly kept the household alive. The afternoon continued with another familiar task: caring for animals. The farmer walked toward the small enclosure beside the village and checked the sheep, chickens, and other livestock. Animals were valuable because they provided food, wool, eggs, milk, transportation, or help with farm work. Keeping them healthy therefore required regular attention. He checked the wooden gate first, making sure it was secure, then looked over the animals for signs of injury or illness. A small bundle of hay was carried into the shelter, and fresh water was placed where the animals could reach it. Chickens pecked around the ground, while sheep moved slowly across the enclosure. These chores might seem minor, but they were repeated every day and could take considerable time. Medieval people lived closely with animals, and the boundary between household and farm was often very practical. The same person who worked in a field might feed a cow, gather eggs, repair a stable, or guide sheep toward pasture. There were few specialized services available to ordinary villagers, so households handled most needs themselves. By the middle of the afternoon, the farmer had already worked in the fields, tended the garden, and checked the animals. Yet several more tasks remained before the day was finished. After checking the animals, the farmer returned to the cottage and noticed that the firewood supply was becoming low. Before evening, he needed to gather more fuel. He walked toward a nearby woodland carrying a simple rope and began collecting fallen branches. Medieval households depended heavily on wood for cooking, heating, and sometimes lighting. Firewood was therefore not something that could be taken for granted. Gathering it could become a regular part of the daily or weekly routine. The farmer selected dry branches that were suitable for burning and tied several together into a manageable bundle. The work was physical, but it was also practical. Cutting or collecting too much wood could be unnecessary, while gathering too little might leave the household cold later. After filling his bundle, he carried it slowly back toward the village. The path passed through fields and small patches of woodland where other villagers were also collecting fuel or useful plants. Returning home, he stacked the branches beneath a simple wooden shelter beside the cottage. Keeping fuel dry was important because wet wood was difficult to burn. Another ordinary task was complete. No dramatic event had occurred, but another essential part of medieval daily life had quietly taken place. With the firewood safely stacked, the farmer turned to another small household responsibility. One of his leather shoes had begun to split near the sole. Instead of replacing it, he sat outside the cottage and examined the damaged leather carefully. Medieval footwear was valuable because making a new pair required skilled work and useful materials. A simple repair could extend the life of an old shoe for months. He gathered a needle, strong thread, and a small piece of leather, then began stitching the damaged section together. His movements were slow and careful. Nearby, another family member was mending a woolen garment using the same practical approach. Clothing was maintained in much the same way as tools and buildings. A torn sleeve could be patched, loose stitching tightened, and worn fabric reused whenever possible. This meant that people often spent part of their free time repairing things rather than buying replacements. The afternoon light gradually became softer as the sun moved lower. The village remained active, but the pace was beginning to change. Some people were returning from the fields, while others continued working around their homes. The farmer finished his shoe repair and tested it by walking a few steps across the courtyard. It was not perfect, but it was useful again. As the afternoon moved toward evening, the farmer walked through the village and noticed how many different kinds of work were happening at once. One person was repairing a wooden cart, another was preparing food, while a craftsman worked on a simple household object. Medieval villages were not filled only with farmers. Depending on the size of the settlement, there could be millers, bakers, blacksmiths, carpenters, potters, weavers, traders, and other skilled workers. Yet even specialized people often performed ordinary household chores themselves. The farmer stopped briefly near a craftsman's workshop and watched him shape a piece of wood. The work required patience and experience, and the craftsman's tools were simple compared with those of later centuries. A wooden mallet, knife, awl, or hand drill could accomplish surprisingly useful things when handled skillfully. The farmer eventually continued home, carrying a small item he had exchanged for some produce earlier. Exchange was an important part of village life. People did not always need coins for every transaction. Food, labor, tools, and useful goods could be exchanged between neighbors. In this way, the village functioned as a network of practical relationships. Much of medieval daily life depended on knowing who could make, repair, grow, or provide something that another household needed. The farmer eventually reached the village market, where the afternoon activity was beginning to slow. A few wooden stalls still displayed bread, vegetables, grain, cloth, pottery, and simple household goods. Markets were important places for exchanging products that families could not easily produce themselves. The farmer carried a small basket of vegetables from his garden and approached a familiar stall. He exchanged part of his produce for a household item he needed. The transaction was simple, but it reflected an important truth about medieval life. People depended on both self-sufficiency and cooperation. A family might grow food, raise animals, and make some clothing, yet still need a miller, blacksmith, potter, or merchant. Market days therefore connected different kinds of workers. Conversations also mattered. People could learn about weather, harvest conditions, prices, distant places, or news from travelers. Yet for most villagers, the market was not merely entertainment. It was part of the practical system that kept households supplied. After finishing his exchange, the farmer placed the goods carefully into his basket and began the walk home. The sun was lower now, and long shadows stretched across the dirt road. Another ordinary part of his day was coming to an end, but there were still evening chores waiting at the cottage. On the walk home, the farmer passed several cottages where families were beginning their evening routines. Smoke rose from small chimneys as hearth fires were prepared for cooking. A woman carried a basket toward a doorway, while children gathered near a wooden fence and an older villager sat repairing a tool. The scene was quiet, but every household was still active. Medieval evenings did not begin with everyone suddenly stopping work. Instead, tasks gradually shifted from outdoor labor to domestic responsibilities. The farmer entered his own courtyard and placed the market goods on a wooden table. He then checked the small garden once more, looking at the plants before darkness arrived. The garden did not require much attention, but a quick inspection could reveal whether anything needed watering, protecting, or harvesting. He picked a few vegetables that would be used for dinner and carried them inside. In the cottage, the hearth was already being prepared. The farmer washed the vegetables and placed them beside a clay pot. His day had included farming, animal care, gathering wood, repairing belongings, visiting the market, and maintaining the household. None of these activities lasted forever, but together they filled the hours. This was one of the secrets of medieval daily life. People were busy not because they constantly pursued ambitious goals, but because ordinary survival required continuous attention. Inside the cottage, the evening meal slowly came together. The farmer placed vegetables into a clay pot while another family member prepared bread and herbs. The hearth provided both heat and light, making it the center of the household after sunset. Cooking over an open fire required attention because the temperature could not be adjusted with a simple control. Someone had to add wood, move the pot, and watch the food carefully. The meal itself was modest, but it represented many hours of earlier work. The vegetables had been planted and tended, the grain had been harvested and ground, the flour had been baked into bread, and the firewood had been gathered from the surrounding woodland. Nothing appeared magically on the table. Even a simple supper depended on an entire chain of activities. While the food cooked, the farmer sat briefly near the hearth and rested his tired legs. Conversation in the cottage was quiet. They might discuss the day's work, tomorrow's weather, or the condition of the fields. There was no need to fill every moment with entertainment. Sometimes simply sitting beside the fire was enough. As the stew simmered, darkness completely covered the village outside. The sounds of daytime gradually disappeared, leaving only the crackle of burning wood and the occasional movement of animals. The evening meal was finally ready, and the family gathered around the rough wooden table. The farmer served the warm stew into simple clay bowls and placed fresh bread beside them. There were no elaborate dishes or complicated courses for an ordinary rural household. Meals were mainly about nourishment and making good use of whatever food was available. The farmer ate slowly after a long day of physical work. Around him, the cottage was warm from the hearth, and the smell of cooked vegetables filled the small room. A wooden cup held water or another simple drink. The family talked quietly while eating, perhaps discussing which tasks needed to be finished tomorrow. For medieval people, meals were also moments of social connection. Even when life was difficult, sharing food created a familiar rhythm within the household. Once everyone had eaten, the bowls were not simply left on the table, they had to be cleaned and stored. Water was brought from a nearby source, and each useful container was washed carefully. Food that remained was covered and kept for later whenever possible. Waste was limited because producing food had required so much labor. After dinner, the farmer leaned back briefly and listened to the fire. The hardest outdoor work was finished, but the evening was not quite over yet. After dinner, the farmer began cleaning the household utensils. He carried a wooden basin near the hearth and used a small amount of water to wash the clay bowls, wooden spoon, and cooking pot. Water was precious because it had been collected by hand earlier in the day. The dishes, therefore, had to be cleaned carefully without wasting what the household had carried home. Once everything was washed, the farmer placed the items where they could dry and returned the remaining food to its storage place. A simple wooden chest held grain and other provisions, while woven baskets and clay containers kept smaller ingredients organized. Medieval households had to think ahead because food supplies could not always be replaced immediately. A poor harvest, bad weather, or difficult journey could make certain foods scarce. Careful storage was therefore part of everyday survival. The farmer checked the grain sacks and noticed that one was becoming lighter. He made a mental note that more grain would soon need to be obtained. Such small observations were important. Medieval people constantly planned around what they had available. Nothing was measured by modern calendars or digital reminders. Instead, memory, experience, and repeated routines guided household management. By the time the kitchen was clean, the fire had settled into a softer glow, and the village outside had become almost completely quiet. The farmer now turned to a quieter evening task, preparing his tools for tomorrow. He gathered the wooden hoe, small rake, basket, and other simple implements he had used during the day. Each tool was checked for damage before being placed beneath a wooden shelter beside the cottage. A cracked handle could become a serious problem in the field, so repairs were best done before the next morning. He rubbed dirt from the tools and tightened a loose wooden piece with a simple wedge. Nearby, his repaired leather shoe rested beside the wall, ready for another day's work. Medieval households depended heavily on maintaining their possessions because every useful object represented time, skill, and material. Tools were not disposable, clothing was not disposable, even ropes, baskets, wooden containers, and cooking utensils were repaired whenever possible. This careful attitude also meant that people developed practical knowledge from a young age. Children watched adults mend, build, clean, cook, plant, harvest, and care for animals. Over many years, these repeated activities became ordinary skills. The farmer finished checking his tools and looked toward the dark fields outside. There was nothing more he could do there tonight. The crops would remain until morning, the animals were safely enclosed, and the household had enough food for another day. Slowly, his attention shifted from work toward rest. Before going to bed, the farmer stepped outside once more and looked across the village. Night had settled over the fields, and only a few warm glows remained visible through cottage windows. The dirt paths that had been busy during the day were now almost empty. Somewhere nearby, an animal moved inside a wooden shelter, and the faint sound of a closing door disappeared into the darkness. The farmer checked the cottage entrance and made sure the wooden latch was secure. Medieval homes had simple forms of protection, and a strong door was important at night. He also looked toward the animal enclosure to make sure the gate was still closed. Everything appeared quiet. Returning inside, he carried a small candle and placed it carefully near the sleeping area. Light was limited and valuable, so people usually used it only when necessary. The cottage became a much different place after sunset. During the day, it had been a workspace filled with cooking, repairs, and movement. At night, it became a shelter for sleep. The farmer removed his shoes and set them beside the wall. His clothes were kept nearby so they could be put on again the next morning. There was little ceremony surrounding bedtime. After a long day of work, the body simply became tired enough to rest. Rain could affect nearly every part of castle life. A wet courtyard became muddy, making it harder to move carts, animals, and heavy supplies. People entering buildings carried mud on their shoes, increasing the work of servants who cleaned floors and replaced dirty rushes. Wet clothing also needed to be dried, and heavy wool could remain damp for a long time. Firewood was another concern because damp fuel was harder to burn and could produce more smoke. Roofs and gutters required attention as well. A small leak might become a larger problem if it was ignored, especially in rooms used to store food or valuable goods. Workers had to inspect roofs, clear drainage channels, and protect important supplies from water. Rain was therefore more than an inconvenience. It could affect transportation, heating, clothing, cleanliness, and building maintenance all at once. Modern houses separate us from most of these problems, but medieval residents experienced them directly. A rainy day inside a castle could turn many ordinary tasks into slower, wetter, and more difficult work. After months of rain, mud could become one of the most familiar features of castle life. Courtyards, roads, and paths were often made from packed earth, gravel, or uneven stone rather than smooth modern surfaces. Heavy foot traffic quickly disturbed the ground, especially around gates, wells, stables, and storage areas. People carrying supplies had to move carefully to avoid slipping or dropping their loads. Animals made the situation worse by churning the ground with their hooves. Servants could spend part of the day cleaning mud from entrances and floors. Shoes and clothing became dirty quickly, and wet garments needed to dry before they could be comfortably worn again. Mud also affected carts, making the transport of food, firewood, and other supplies more difficult. The castle walls might remain impressive and solid, but the ground around them could be messy and inconvenient. For residents, dealing with mud was simply another small part of maintaining a working household. Life inside the castle was shaped by practical problems that had to be handled repeatedly. Once the first 30 minutes of the story have passed, the castle can begin to feel less like a grand palace and more like a busy medieval workplace. Its towers, walls, and halls were impressive, but nearly every part of the building demanded effort. Water had to be carried, fires maintained, food stored, clothing repaired, floors cleaned, and animals cared for. Even simple movement through the castle could involve narrow stairs, uneven stones, and crowded passages. Residents depended on servants, craftsmen, farmers, and merchants to keep supplies moving. The castle's strength came from organization as much as from stone. Without people constantly working, the household could not function for long. This is one reason the romantic image of castle life can be misleading. A castle could represent wealth and power while still offering limited privacy, weak lighting, uncomfortable temperatures, and difficult sanitation. For ordinary residents, these conditions were not unusual. They were simply part of the world they understood. The impressive exterior hid a daily routine built around work, maintenance, and survival. Castle doors were built for strength, not convenience. Heavy wooden doors could be difficult to open, especially when reinforced with iron fittings. Some entrances needed several people to move or secure them properly. Smaller interior doors were easier to manage, but they still had simple latches, bars, or locks that required care. At night, important entrances had to be secured, and guards could be responsible for checking them. Moving supplies through narrow doorways could also become awkward. A person carrying a basket, bucket, or bundle of firewood had to work around heavy doors and busy passages. Drafts were another problem. When a door opened during cold weather, outside air could quickly enter a room. Thick curtains or additional wooden barriers could reduce some of the cold, but they could not stop every draft. Modern doors are designed for easy movement, insulation, and security at the same time. Medieval castle doors placed security first. Their great strength protected the household, but everyday movement through them could be slow, heavy, and inconvenient. Castle windows reveal another difference between medieval life and modern homes. Many openings were narrow because thick walls and defensive needs were important. Some windows had shutters, wooden coverings, or simple glass in wealthier areas, but large bright windows were uncommon in defensive parts of a fortress. During the day, limited sunlight could make rooms dim, especially when the weather was cloudy. At night, shutters helped protect the interior from wind and cold, but they also blocked whatever natural light remained. Sitting beside a window might provide a pleasant view of the countryside, yet the opening itself could still allow drafts into the room. Workers sometimes had to clean or maintain shutters and window fittings, while damaged openings required repair. The modern expectation of large sealed windows that provide light, ventilation, and insulation would have been unfamiliar. A castle window was mainly shaped by the needs and materials of its time. It offered a connection to the outside world, but it also reminded residents that defense and practicality came before comfort. The castle walls also affected how people moved around the building. A fortress could contain towers, halls, kitchens, storage rooms, workshops, courtyards, and private chambers, often connected by narrow passages and stairs. A task that seems simple today could require a long walk through several parts of the complex. Carrying water from a well to a kitchen, moving firewood to a hearth, or taking food from a storage room to the Great Hall all required physical effort. Servants learned the routes through daily repetition, but visitors could easily become confused. Thick walls and enclosed passages could make some areas dark, while different levels created additional stairs to climb. The castle's design was practical for defense and organization, but it was not planned around quick movement or accessibility. Residents adapted because they had no alternative. They carried loads by hand, climbed stairs repeatedly, and became familiar with every corner of the building. The Grand Castle therefore demanded constant movement from the people who kept it functioning, turning ordinary chores into surprisingly physical work. The castle courtyard also had to accommodate animals, deliveries, and everyday work. Horses arrived with riders, carts brought supplies, and workers moved between the stables, kitchens, workshops, and storage buildings. This activity could make the courtyard noisy and crowded. A person carrying a bucket might need to step aside for a cart, while someone leading a horse had to navigate around other workers. During wet weather, the ground became muddy, and during dry weather, dust could rise from constant movement. The courtyard was therefore a practical space rather than a peaceful garden. Its layout reflected the needs of a working community. Wells, ovens, storage areas, workshops, and entrances were positioned to support daily tasks. People who lived there became used to the sounds and smells of ordinary activity. From a modern perspective, the lack of separation between work, animals, storage, and living spaces might seem uncomfortable. For medieval residents, however, these arrangements were familiar. The castle functioned because every part of the courtyard had a purpose, even when that purpose made daily life busy and messy. The castle chapel could offer a quieter place, but it was not necessarily warm or comfortable. Many chapels were built with thick stone walls and narrow windows. Just like other parts of the fortress, wooden benches or simple seats provided little softness, and winter mornings could feel especially cold. Religious services and prayers were part of daily life for many medieval people, so residents might enter the chapel at regular times. Candles provided some light, while simple decorations or painted images added color to otherwise plain stone surfaces. The chapel was not designed like a modern, comfortable room. Its purpose was spiritual rather than luxurious. Even so, it could provide a moment away from the noise of kitchens, courtyards, workshops, and crowded halls. For someone tired after a long day, a quiet chapel might have felt peaceful despite the hard benches and cold walls. The contrast is important. Medieval comfort often meant finding a small improvement within difficult surroundings rather than expecting the entire environment to be comfortable. Castles also had to protect valuable supplies from fire. Open flames were essential for cooking, heating, and lighting, yet fire could become dangerous when used around timber, straw, cloth, and stored materials. Kitchens were especially important because large hearths burned regularly. Workers needed to manage flames carefully and keep combustible items away from the hottest areas. Candles and lamps created additional risks in bedrooms, corridors, and halls. A careless flame could damage property or spread quickly through wooden structures. Medieval castles used stone extensively, which helped create fire-resistant areas, but roofs, floors, doors, furniture, and beams could still burn. Water was available in some places, yet fighting a large fire remained difficult. Residents therefore had to balance the need for warmth and light with constant awareness of danger. The hearth that made a cold chamber bearable could also threaten the entire household if something went wrong. Modern buildings use electrical systems, alarms, extinguishers, and carefully designed safety measures. Medieval residents relied mainly on experience, caution, and constant attention. Castle storage areas could be dark, crowded, and difficult to organize. Supplies were often kept in rooms beneath halls, inside towers, or in other protected spaces. Grain, barrels, tools, clothing, and household equipment all needed places where they could remain reasonably safe. Heavy items had to be moved carefully, especially when stairways were narrow. A worker carrying a sack could struggle to see clearly if the room had only a small window or a single lamp. Storage also required protection from moisture. Damp stone could damage wood, cloth, and food, so workers had to choose suitable locations and check supplies regularly. Some goods were kept in barrels, chests, baskets, or clay containers, depending on what they contained. Organization mattered because a large household could consume supplies quickly. If an important item was misplaced, finding it might require searching several rooms. There were no digital inventories or convenient labels. People relied on memory, experience, and simple records. The castle stores therefore required constant attention, just like every other part of the household. Maintaining clothing was another quiet but important part of castle life. Fabric was valuable because making it required growing or obtaining fibers, spinning thread, weaving cloth, and sewing garments by hand. When clothing became worn, people usually repaired it instead of throwing it away. A small tear could be stitched, while larger damage might require patch. Wool garments could be reshaped or reused when they were no longer suitable for their original owner. Laundry also required effort. Water had to be collected, and washing involved soaking, rubbing, rinsing, and drying garments without modern machines. Heavy wool was particularly difficult to clean and dry. Clothing could also absorb smoke from fires and odors from crowded living spaces. For people spending long days near hearths, animals, and workshops, keeping garments fresh was challenging, yet good clothing was essential for warmth and protection. Every cloak, tunic, shirt, and pair of shoes represented valuable work. The resident of a medieval castle therefore learned to care for clothing carefully because replacing it was neither quick nor simple. The final hours of the day brought a slower rhythm to the castle, but work did not stop completely. Fires needed to be checked, doors secured, animals settled, and important supplies protected. Servants finished cleaning the great hall and kitchen while guards prepared for the night watch. Lamps and candles were lit in selected rooms, creating small pools of warm light against a dark stone. People gathered near the hearth when possible, enjoying the limited warmth after a long day. Others prepared their beds or completed quiet tasks, such as repairing clothing. The castle gradually became darker and quieter, although footsteps could still be heard in nearby passages. Outside, the battlements faced the night sky while watchmen remained alert. For residents, nighttime was not simply a period of complete rest. The household still needed protection and maintenance. Yet, compared with the busy hours of daylight, the evening could provide a welcome sense of calm. After all the carrying, cleaning, cooking, repairing, and organizing, the castle slowly settled into silence. Night inside a medieval castle was never completely dark or completely silent. A few candles or lamps might remain burning in important areas, while the hearth provided a faint glow in occupied rooms. Guards continued their rounds, listening for unusual sounds beyond the walls. Servants might still move quietly through corridors if work required it. For someone resting in a chamber, distant footsteps could occasionally break the silence. Wind passing through narrow openings could make soft sounds against wooden shutters and stone walls. In winter, the cold became more noticeable once the fires were reduced. Thick blankets and wool clothing offered some protection, but the room could still feel chilly. A person might sleep beneath several layers while keeping the body close to whatever warmth remained. Modern bedrooms are designed to control temperature, light, and noise, but medieval chambers offered little such control. The night was simply another environment to adapt to. After a long day of work, residents rested as comfortably as their bedding, clothing, and surroundings allowed. Morning returned slowly to the medieval castle. Before many residents began their work, servants were already tending fires and preparing the household for another day. Water needed to be collected, food prepared, animals checked, and rooms opened for activity. The first light entered through narrow windows, revealing stone walls, wooden beams, and the remains of the previous evening's fire. A person waking in the castle did not simply get ready and walk into a modern kitchen. Almost every part of the morning depended on someone completing a practical task. Clothes had to be found, footwear prepared, and warmth maintained. The great hall gradually filled with movement as workers carried supplies and residents gathered for breakfast. Outside, the courtyard became active with carts, animals, and people beginning their duties. The castle looked peaceful from a distance, but inside, another day of work was already underway. This daily rhythm repeated again and again, showing that castle life depended less on luxury than on organization, labor, and constant preparation. The morning meal in a medieval castle was usually practical and filling rather than elaborate. Bread was an important food, sometimes served with cheese, vegetables, porridge, eggs, fish, or meat depending on wealth and availability. A warm drink or simple ale might accompany the meal. Before anyone could eat, however, servants had already spent time preparing the food and tending the fire. Grain needed grinding, ingredients had to be brought from storage, and cooking vessels needed to be cleaned afterward. Large households consumed considerable quantities of food, so the kitchen remained busy throughout the day. Meals also followed social customs. Important residents could receive better portions or more varied dishes, while servants and workers had simpler food. Even when the table looked generous, the meal represented a large amount of hidden labor. Someone had grown or obtained the ingredients, preserved them, carried them into the castle, prepared them, cooked them, served them, and cleaned afterward. Eating was easy compared with everything required to make the meal possible. The castle blacksmith had an important role in keeping everyday life working. Metal objects were needed for doors, hinges, locks, tools, cooking equipment, and many other practical tasks. A blacksmith worked near a hot forge, shaping heated metal with hammers and simple tools. The work was physically demanding and required skill, patience, and attention. Sparks could fly from the forge, while smoke and heat made the workshop uncomfortable. Tools could break or wear out, so repairs were often necessary. A damaged hinge might prevent a heavy door from working properly, while a broken cooking tool could affect the kitchen. Even small metal parts were important because the castle depended on hundreds of ordinary objects. The blacksmith, therefore, supported many different areas of daily life. From the great hall to the kitchen and stable, metalwork helped keep the household functioning. The castle's strength came from stone walls, but its daily operation also depended on craftsmen quietly repairing the tools and fittings that everyone used. The carpenter was another essential worker inside and around the castle. Wood was needed for doors, tables, benches, beds, chests, carts, tools, roofs, and countless smaller objects. A skilled carpenter could repair damaged furniture or create new pieces when something wore out. Timber had to be measured, cut, shaped, joined, and sometimes reinforced with metal fittings. The work produced wood shavings and required a suitable workspace, often close to the courtyard or workshops. Unlike modern furniture, medieval wooden objects were made individually and could take considerable time to produce. A broken chair could not simply be replaced from a nearby store. Someone had to repair it by hand. Large repairs were even more demanding. Roof beams, doors, bridges, and wooden structures all needed strong and carefully prepared timber. The carpenter's work, therefore, connected comfort with survival. A bed needed wood, a door needed wood, and storage chests protected valuable belongings. Much of castle life depended on ordinary wooden objects that required constant care. The mason's work was just as important as the carpenter's. Medieval castles depended on stone walls, towers, stairways, floors, fireplaces, and foundations. Building and repairing these structures required heavy physical labor. Stones had to be cut, shaped, moved, and placed carefully, often using simple tools and lifting equipment. Mortar was prepared by hand, and workers spent long hours exposed to weather while repairing damaged sections. A castle wall might look permanent, but rain, frost, movement, and everyday use could gradually weaken parts of it. Small cracks needed attention before they became serious problems. Masons also repaired fireplaces, doorways, and other stone features inside the castle. Their work was slow because every piece had to fit correctly. Modern construction uses machines and standardized materials, but medieval builders depended mainly on human skill and organized labor. The impressive towers that survive today were created and maintained through countless hours of physical work. For people living inside the castle, stone was not simply decoration, it was the material that provided protection, shelter, and endless. Castle life also depended on nearby farms and villages. A fortress could not produce everything it needed inside its walls. Grain, vegetables, livestock, firewood, cloth, and other supplies often came from surrounding lands. Farmers worked outside the castle while merchants and carts transported goods towards the gates. During harvest seasons, the movement of food could become especially important. Workers inside the castle then had to unload, inspect, store, and organize these supplies. This connection meant that the castle was part of a larger community rather than an isolated world. A grand fortress might dominate the landscape, but its residents depended on the labor of people living beyond the walls. Bad harvests, poor weather, or disrupted roads could affect the amount of food available. Maintaining a secure supply therefore required planning and cooperation. From the perspective of someone living inside the castle, a simple loaf of bread represented work that had started far away in a field. Castle comfort depended on an entire network of people, animals, land, and transportation. Traveling to and from a medieval castle was another source of discomfort. Roads were often rough, muddy, or uneven, and journeys depended heavily on weather. A person traveling by horse could still experience long hours of movement, while those walking carried their own supplies or relied on pack animals. Carts were useful for transporting heavy goods, but wheels could become stuck in mud or damaged on difficult roads. Bridges and river crossings also affected travel. A journey that looks short on a modern map could take much longer when roads were poor and transportation was slow. Visitors arriving at a castle therefore did not simply step out of a comfortable vehicle at the gate. They might arrive tired, dirty, wet, and covered in road dust. Supplies also reached the castle through these difficult routes, so weather and road conditions could affect the household. The castle walls offered protection once people arrived, but reaching those walls could itself be a demanding experience. Medieval travel was slow, physical, and closely connected to the condition of the landscape. Guests arriving at a medieval castle could create extra work for everyone inside. Visitors needed food, water, sleeping space, and sometimes care for their horses. Servants prepared rooms, carried luggage, arranged meals, and made sure the household had enough supplies. Important guests might receive better rooms or more comfortable bedding, while ordinary travelers had simpler arrangements. A sudden arrival could place pressure on the kitchen and storage areas, especially if many people came together. Horses needed stables, feed, and water, while carts had to be placed somewhere secure. The castle therefore had to adapt quickly to changes in the number of people living inside its walls. Hosting visitors could be socially important, but it was not effortless. Every guest increased the demand for food, fuel, water, cleaning, and attention. For the people doing the work, hospitality meant additional physical labor. The impressive welcome seen by an important visitor was supported by servants quietly carrying supplies, preparing rooms, lighting fires, and organizing meals behind the scenes. By this point, the castle begins to look very different from the romantic image we often imagine. Its towers were impressive, but the rooms could be cold. Its halls were grand, but they could be crowded and noisy. Its walls offered protection, but they also limited light and fresh air. Almost every convenience required human effort. Water had to be carried, food prepared, fires maintained, clothing repaired, and waste removed. Even sleeping required adapting to cold stone, rough bedding, and household sounds. Wealth could improve some conditions, but it could not completely remove the limitations of medieval technology. A powerful lord might have a larger chamber, better food, finer clothing, and more servants, yet the basic environment remained shaped by the same materials and methods. The castle was built for security, authority, and survival. Comfort came second. For the people who lived there, these conditions were normal rather than shocking. They knew how to work around them, just as modern people accept the limitations of their own time. The real story of castle life is therefore found in these ordinary details. One of the biggest differences between medieval and modern life was the amount of physical effort required for simple tasks. Today, turning on a light, heating water, washing clothes, or preparing a meal can take only minutes. Inside a medieval castle, each of these activities required several steps. Water had to be carried, wood had to be burned, food had to be prepared by hand, and clothing had to be washed without machines. Even moving supplies around the building required walking and lifting. This constant physical activity shaped the lives of castle residents. Servants and workers became strong through repeated labor, but the work could also be exhausting. There was little separation between household maintenance and daily life because people themselves provided the energy needed to keep everything running. The castle was therefore a place where convenience was rare. What modern people consider automatic or effortless often depended on someone's hands, time, and strength. Once we understand this, the uncomfortable side of medieval castle life becomes much easier to imagine. Personal hygiene was another area where medieval castle life differed greatly from modern expectations. People could wash their hands, faces, and bodies, but bathing required more preparation than simply turning on a shower. Water had to be collected, heated when warm water was wanted, and carried to the place where washing took place. Fuel was needed to heat the water, and servants often helped prepare baths for wealthier residents. Ordinary workers had fewer resources and might wash more simply. Clothing also played an important role in cleanliness because linen garments could be changed and washed more easily than heavy outer layers. Castles did have methods for dealing with waste, but sanitation was limited by the technology of the period. Latrines, drains, wells, and water sources had to be managed carefully to reduce problems. Living among many people and animals made cleanliness an ongoing challenge. Modern plumbing has made hygiene quick and private. In a medieval castle, it was a practical task requiring water, fuel, time, labor, and planning. A medieval castle could also feel crowded, especially when the household was large. Nobles, relatives, servants, guards, craftsmen, visitors, and workers might all be present at different times. Some people had private chambers, but many others shared rooms or sleeping spaces. The Great Hall, kitchens, courtyards, and workshops were often busy throughout the day. This meant that personal space was limited. A person might have a designated bed or chamber, yet people could still enter for work, cleaning, messages, or other duties. Noise traveled through stone passages, and privacy was difficult to maintain. Large gatherings could make the castle feel even more crowded. During important events, additional guests might arrive and increase the demand for food, water, bedding, and firewood. The castle had to function as a community, so cooperation was essential. Modern homes are often designed around individual privacy, but medieval castles were built around shared spaces and practical needs. For residents, living close to others was normal. The lack of privacy was simply another part of the social world they knew. The castle's defenses also influenced everyday comfort. Thick walls, strong gates, towers, and narrow openings helped protect residents, but defensive construction could make the interior feel enclosed. Guards needed to watch entrances and important sections of the walls, while doors and gates had to be secured at appropriate times. Battlements were exposed to wind, rain, and cold, yet watchmen still had to remain alert. Stairs leading to towers could be steep and narrow, making repeated climbs tiring. In bad weather, the stone surfaces became wet and slippery. The defensive design was never intended to make life pleasant. Its purpose was to make the castle difficult to enter and easier to protect. Residents accepted the inconvenience because security was valuable. From a modern perspective, it is easy to admire the dramatic towers and battlements without considering what they felt like to use every day. For medieval people, however, those impressive structures were working parts of the castle. Protection came with cold, exposure, climbing, and constant responsibility. The castle gate was one of the most important places in the entire fortress. It controlled who and what entered the settlement, so guards had to remain alert. Carts carrying food or firewood could arrive at the gate. while visitors, merchants, workers, and travelers waited to be admitted. Checking people and supplies required attention and sometimes created delays. The gate area could become crowded, especially during busy periods. Heavy wooden doors and defensive mechanisms were built for security, not speed. Opening and closing them required effort, and at night they might remain firmly secured. Guards working there had to deal with weather as well. Rain, cold wind, or strong sunlight could make long periods of duty uncomfortable. The impressive entrance that visitors see in a castle today was therefore a working checkpoint. It protected the community but also required people to monitor it continuously. Every arrival passed through a system designed around caution and security, reminding everyone that the castle was ultimately a defensive settlement rather than a comfortable palace. As evening approached, the castle's working rhythm gradually changed. The kitchens became quieter after the main meal, servants finished cleaning, and workers returned tools to their proper places. Fires were checked and prepared for the night while important doors and gates were secured. Candles and lamps provided small areas of light, leaving much of the building in shadow. Residents gathered near warm hearths when possible, talking quietly or completing simple tasks. Guards began or continued their night duties, making sure the castle remained secure. Outside, the courtyard became calmer as animals settled in their stables and most daily movement stopped. Yet the castle never became completely inactive. A large household required people to remain awake for different responsibilities. The night was therefore a gradual transition rather than an instant silence. After a day filled with carrying, cooking, cleaning, repairing, and organizing, residents could finally rest. The castle's stone walls stood quietly around them, protecting the household while also holding in the cold, darkness, and sounds of the night. By late evening, most of the castle had become quiet. The great hall no longer echoed with the movement of servants, and the kitchen fires had been reduced after the final meal. A few candles still burned in important rooms, while the remaining warmth of the hearth slowly faded. Residents prepared for sleep beneath wool blankets and simple bedding. Some chambers were shared, and even private rooms could remain cold and dim. Outside, guards continued their watch along the walls and near the gates. Their work was essential because the castle's security depended on people staying alert through the night. Wind moved across the battlements while the surrounding countryside disappeared into darkness. Inside, small sounds remained: footsteps in a corridor, the closing of a wooden door, or the crackle of a dying fire. For most residents, this was simply the end of another ordinary day. The castle had provided protection, but it had demanded constant work in return. Its walls were strong, yet life inside them was shaped by effort, limited light, cold rooms, and simple necessities. Looking back at the day, the reality of castle life becomes clearer. The stone walls, towers, and grand halls were impressive, but comfort depended on countless ordinary tasks. Someone carried the water, someone gathered the firewood, someone prepared the food, cleaned the floors, repaired clothing, cared for animals, and checked the stores. These jobs repeated day after day, regardless of weather or season. Even wealthy residents depended on the system. Their better rooms and finer belongings could make life easier, but they could not create modern heating, plumbing, lighting, or privacy. The castle remained a product of its time, designed around defense and survival. Its residents learned to adapt to darkness, cold, smoke, noise, and hard physical work. What seems uncomfortable to us was simply familiar to them. This does not mean medieval people were constantly unhappy. They had friendships, celebrations, traditions, meals, stories, and moments of peace. It simply means that comfort looked different. A warm hearth, fresh bread, dry clothing, and a quiet corner could feel remarkably valuable. As the night deepened, the castle settled into a quieter rhythm. The great hall was dark. The kitchens were still, and most residents had gone to their sleeping places. A few fires continued to glow, providing enough warmth to keep the cold from becoming too severe. Guards remained awake, watching the walls and listening to the sounds beyond the gates. Inside the chambers, people rested beneath blankets while the stone around them slowly absorbed the remaining heat. For a modern observer, the room might seem cold, dark, and uncomfortable. For a medieval resident, it was simply home. The castle had protected them through another day, and tomorrow would bring the same familiar cycle of work. Water would be carried again, fires would be lit, food would be prepared, and floors would be cleaned. The strength of the castle depended on this repetition. Its walls could stand for centuries, but daily life continued through small human efforts. Slowly, the final sounds faded, leaving only the quiet atmosphere of the sleeping fortress beneath the night sky. At last, the castle becomes still. The final candles burn low, the great hall rests in darkness, and the remaining warmth of the hearth slowly disappears into the cold stone. Beyond the walls, the night stretches quietly across the medieval countryside. Inside, the residents sleep beneath simple blankets, while a few guards continue their patient watch. For all its towers, gates, and impressive walls, the castle was never truly a place of effortless comfort. It was a home shaped by defense, work, weather, and necessity. Water had to be carried, fires tended, food prepared, clothing repaired, and rooms maintained. Yet people made lives within these difficult surroundings. They shared meals, told stories, worked together, celebrated important days, and found warmth wherever they could. Perhaps that is the most interesting part of the story. The castle did not need to be comfortable by modern standards to feel like home to the people who lived there. Now the last sounds fade away. The stone corridors grow quiet. The courtyard rests beneath the night sky, and the old castle finally settles into peaceful silence. Good night. He then looked toward the garden and decided to harvest a few vegetables before the heat of the afternoon became stronger. With his basket in hand, he stepped outside again, continuing the endless sequence of ordinary tasks that shaped medieval life. The farmer walked into the cottage garden and began gathering vegetables for the next meal. He selected onions, beans, and a few herbs, checking each plant before placing the produce into his woven basket. A garden required regular attention, but it could provide valuable food close to home. Medieval households often relied on several sources of food at once. Fields supplied grain, gardens supplied vegetables and herbs, animals supplied milk, eggs, wool, and meat, while markets provided things that could not easily be produced at home. The farmer carefully avoided taking more than the household needed immediately. Fresh food could spoil, so timing mattered. Some produce was eaten quickly, while other foods could be dried, stored, or preserved. After filling the basket, he pulled a few weeds from between the plants and loosened the soil around a young row of vegetables. The work was quiet, and the afternoon air had become warmer. In the distance, a cart moved slowly along the village road, carrying goods toward the market. The farmer watched it for a moment before returning to his garden. He then carried the basket inside and placed the vegetables near the cooking area. Another small part of the household's food supply had been secured. It was not a dramatic achievement, but for an ordinary medieval family, these small successes accumulated into survival. After putting away the vegetables, the farmer turned toward the cottage roof. He had noticed a loose section of thatch several days earlier, and the weather was finally dry enough to repair it. He carried a wooden ladder toward the side of the cottage and carefully climbed upward. The roof was made from natural materials that needed regular maintenance, especially after rain and strong winds. From above, he could see the village more clearly. Narrow paths connected the cottages, small gardens surrounded many homes, and fields stretched outward toward the woodland. He located the damaged section and carefully replaced the loose thatch with fresh material. The work required balance and patience because a mistake could cause a fall. After securing the new thatch, he pressed the surrounding material firmly into place so that rainwater would run away from the wall. This kind of repair was important because a damaged roof could allow water into the living space and spoil stored food or bedding. When the work was finished, he climbed down slowly and looked back at the roof. The repair was modest, but it could protect the household for another season. He returned the ladder to its place and wiped the dust from his hands. The afternoon was moving toward evening, and the farmer still had to check the animals and prepare enough firewood for the night. As evening approached, the farmer began preparing the household for another night. He checked the animal enclosure, made sure the gate was secure, and carried fresh hay into the shelter. The sheep gathered around the feeding area while chickens settled near the wooden fence. Afterward, he returned to the cottage and inspected the firewood stack. There was enough fuel for the evening meal, so he carried several dry branches inside and placed them beside the hearth. The final daylight was fading across the village, and smoke rose gently from neighboring cottages. The farmer washed his hands, gathered the vegetables from earlier, and began preparing dinner. The simple routine felt familiar: fire, food, cleaning, and rest. After such a long day, there was little need for anything complicated. The household depended on these repeated actions, and each one helped prepare them for tomorrow. Outside, the fields were becoming quiet, while inside the cottage the hearth slowly filled the room with warmth. The farmer stirred the cooking pot and listened to the soft sounds of the evening. Another ordinary medieval day was approaching its end. The farmer sat beside the hearth while the evening meal slowly cooked. After a full day of farming, repairs, gardening, animal care, and household work, this was one of the few moments when he could simply sit and rest. The cottage was warm, and the smell of vegetables and herbs filled the small room. He occasionally stirred the clay pot and added another piece of wood to the fire. Outside, the village was becoming quieter as the last people returned home. There were no bright streetlights or distant sounds of traffic. Darkness gradually covered the fields and paths, leaving the hearth as one of the main sources of light inside the cottage. The farmer looked around at the simple room. Every object had a purpose: the wooden table for meals, the clay pots for cooking, the chest for storage, and the wool blankets for warmth. Nothing was simply decoration. After dinner, these same objects would be cleaned and placed ready for the next day. The farmer's life was built around repetition, but repetition did not mean that every day was exactly the same. Weather, seasons, crops, animals, visitors, repairs, and unexpected problems constantly changed the details. Still, the basic rhythm remained familiar. Work filled the daylight, while evening gradually brought the household toward rest. After the meal, the farmer began the final household chores of the evening. He washed the clay bowls and wooden spoon, wiped the cooking area, and carefully stored the remaining food. The water was used sparingly because it had been carried from the well earlier in the day. Once the kitchen was clean, he checked the grain sacks and other stored supplies. Medieval households had to know what they possessed because food could not simply be purchased whenever something ran out. A household might keep grain, dried vegetables, preserved foods, firewood, and other necessities in separate places. The farmer noticed that the firewood stack was still sufficient for several days, but the grain supply would eventually need replenishing. He made a mental note to visit the mill when necessary. There were no written shopping lists for every small need. Memory and routine guided much of household management. After checking the supplies, he placed his tools in their usual location and examined the repaired basket from earlier. It was still strong enough for carrying vegetables. Outside, the village was now almost completely dark. A few faint lights remained visible through cottage windows, but most outdoor work had stopped. The farmer closed the wooden door and returned to the hearth. The day's responsibilities were nearly finished, leaving only the quiet preparation for sleep. The farmer stepped outside for one final look at the village before going to bed. The night air was cooler now, and the sky above the cottages was dark and clear. Without electric lights, the stars were far more visible than they would be in a modern village. He stood quietly beside the cottage and listened. The animals were mostly silent, the fields were still, and only an occasional sound came from a nearby home. During the day, the same place had been filled with movement. People had walked to the fields, carried water, repaired fences, tended animals, gathered food, and exchanged goods. Now the paths were empty. The farmer checked the wooden gate one last time and then returned inside. He understood that tomorrow would bring many of the same responsibilities, but there was comfort in knowing what needed to be done. Medieval life could be uncertain in major ways, especially when weather, illness, harvests, or shortages caused problems. Yet ordinary routines offered a sense of structure. The farmer placed a few final pieces of wood near the hearth and made sure the fire was safe. He then prepared his sleeping area, removed his worn shoes, and folded his clothing nearby. The cottage was simple, but it was familiar. After a long day surrounded by practical work, he was ready to let the darkness become quiet and let sleep take over. The farmer settled onto the straw mattress and pulled the wool blanket over himself. The cottage was quiet now, with only the faint warmth of the hearth remaining. His body was tired from the day's physical work, and there was little reason to remain awake. The simple sleeping space offered no luxury, but it was familiar and comfortable enough after a long day. Around him, the few household possessions rested exactly where they had been placed. The repaired tools waited outside. The food was safely stored and the animals were enclosed. Everything that could reasonably be prepared for tomorrow had been completed. For an ordinary medieval person, this sense of readiness mattered. The next day would begin with many of the same responsibilities, but careful preparation could make those tasks easier. The farmer thought briefly about the fields and the loose fence section he had repaired earlier. He remembered the grain supply and the roof that had needed attention. These thoughts slowly faded as he became more tired. Outside, the village remained peaceful beneath the night sky. Somewhere beyond the cottage, a small animal moved through the darkness while the wind brushed softly against the roof. The farmer closed his eyes. Another day of medieval life had passed without any extraordinary event, yet it had contained everything necessary for survival: food, work, maintenance, animals, shelter, and rest. The final hour before dawn passed quietly. The farmer slept while the village rested around him. His cottage, fields, animals, tools, and stored food all waited for another morning. Looking back at the day, there had been no single event that defined it. Instead, the hours had been filled with ordinary work: preparing meals, collecting water, tending crops, caring for animals, repairing fences, gathering firewood, fixing clothing and tools, storing food, and maintaining the home. This was the reality of daily life for many medieval people. Their lives were not spent entirely in castles, battles, festivals, or dramatic adventures. Most people lived much quieter lives, and much of their time was devoted to keeping themselves, their families, and their communities functioning. Their work followed the seasons and the daylight. Spring brought planting, summer demanded constant care, autumn required harvesting, and winter encouraged indoor repairs and preparation. The farmer's routine was therefore part of a much larger rhythm that had existed for generations. As the night slowly approached its end, the first faint light began to appear beyond the horizon. Birds would soon begin calling, animals would stir, and smoke would rise again from village hearths. The farmer would wake, start the fire, collect water, and begin again. The cycle was simple, repetitive, and deeply connected to the natural world. And so, the ordinary medieval day comes quietly to an end. Before sunrise, there will be water to collect, animals to feed, fields to inspect, food to prepare, tools to repair, and countless small responsibilities waiting for another day. But for now, the village is still. The farmer sleeps beneath his wool blanket while the fields rest under the dark sky. What did people really do all day in the Middle Ages? Mostly, they worked to keep life going. They grew food, prepared meals, cared for animals, maintained their homes, repaired what they owned, traded with neighbors, raised families, and rested when the day's light was gone. Their lives could be difficult, but they were also filled with familiar routines, quiet moments, community, and the simple satisfaction of completing necessary work. There were no screens, notifications, engines, or electric lights to divide the day into endless distractions. Instead, time moved with the sun, the seasons, the weather, and the needs of the household. The last embers of the hearth glow softly in the darkness. Outside, the village sleeps. The fields are quiet. The animals are settled. Another ordinary day has passed. And for a little while longer, nothing needs to be done. The story fades gently into silence, leaving only the peaceful darkness of the medieval night.